One of the great pleasures of my job is the opportunity of meeting new, what we call data partners. Data partners arise in our world the same way our relationship with the Federal Statistical Research Data Center arises, namely the availability of a fabulous population or populations and data existing somewhere in the world, like say in Clalit, in which we don't have the opportunity ourselves of hosting the data, but we do have the opportunity of developing access to the data. And of course, in return for the downside of not being able ourselves to directly host it, we do gain one enormous thing, which is fabulous partners. And it is in that vein that I have the pleasure of introducing Irina Stepnikova, who I had the pleasure of meeting first here at Stanford when she came to visit her former mentor, Karen Cook, many of you know, in the sociology department, but later to return the visit and go to Brno in the Czech Republic, where Irina, along with many colleagues, has been working for some years at the development of a truly unusual data resource, and with it a fabulous group of investigators spanning a quite different cross-section of data than those that we have been discussing up until now. A couple of things worth saying. Irina herself is, again, trained in sociology, largely here, although she's a native of Brno, and continues to return from where she's now working as an associate professor at the Public Health School of the University of Alabama in Birmingham, but spends several months every year returning to her native Masaryk University, where this great data set is housed. I will say I'm not sure we have many of the geneticists still left in the crowd, but Brno, for those of you who don't know it, is famous for many things, but probably most famous for being the home of Gregor Mendel. To get a chance to visit his monastery and his little peas while out there. So this is where it all started. But with no further ado, Dr. Stepnikova.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for coming. It's a tremendous pleasure to be back here to my beloved alma mater, and how appropriate that this is at the Alumni Center, right? Because I'm an alumni. So I would like to talk to you guys today about a database that I think is really unique and has a lot of potential, and probably the best thing about it is that it's unmined, like pretty much completely unmined. The data set is called European Longitudinal Study of Pregnancy and Childhood in Czech Republic. And the data set right now is housed at the Research Center for Toxic Compounds in the Environment, and that's a part of Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. Now, as you probably see on the slides, and I cannot quite see it on that technical screen down there, but you will see that they do a lot of things with analyzing environmental toxins that I'm not going to even pretend to understand at all. But interestingly for me, they have gotten interested in epidemiological studies, especially in longitudinal studies of birth cohorts, because they started understanding that if we want to understand the impact of toxins on health, we need to start taking longitudinal approach and start looking across the life course. So that's where the longitudinal focus comes in. So here are just a few thoughts about how toxins might be important for the health, and the point here is that the impact of toxins may start in pregnancy or even before conception, and then can carry across the life course. So the concept that is carrying this focus is exposome, and I am not sure to what degree that has become popular in this community. It is certainly quite popular in Europe right now as a way of looking at the totality of exposures to a human being over the life course. So the idea of exposome is that it is environmental toxins, obviously, that are gonna have impacts on health, but there are also other types of exposures, and social exposures are a part of it. So that's what I am interested in. I am interested in the social environment as a type of influence on human health and how that interacts with the toxins in the environment. So the epidemiological studies that Resetox is now interested in look at several birth cohorts. ELSPAC CZ is one of them, and it has about 7,500 families that they have tracked since pregnancy. But there is also something called Central European Longitudinal Study of Pregnancy and Childhood, and this one combines the Czech cohort with Slovak cohort. So Slovak Republic also had a longitudinal study carried out at about the same time. Both of these are now housed at Resetox. And then there are some newer cohorts that are starting Cardiovision with about 2,500 respondents focusing specifically on cardiovascular health. So ELSPAC, that's the main topic of my study. ELSPAC was initiated in the 90s by WHO. The goal of the study was to understand the factors that contribute to health in mothers and children in Europe. And there were several countries participating in the study, with Great Britain being the first of them, and the cohort is called ELSPAC. Some of you might know it. It's AVEN, Longitudinal Study of Pregnancy and Childhood. It was carried out in Bristol, and the Czech cohort pretty much took that ELSPAC study and translated into Czech, and just that was it. So the Czech cohort is a clone, essentially, of ELSPAC in terms of collecting survey data. So survey data are the main part of this cohort. There are also medical chart reviews data and clinical examinations. But unlike ELSPAC, unlike the British cohort, the ELSPAC cohort does not have biosamples. They didn't collect any biosamples. Okay, so this cohort that was conducted in 2 regions of the Czech Republic, in Brno and Znojmo, collected information on about 7,500 mothers during mid-pregnancy, and they followed the moms and their children, and also the fathers, if they were available, up till about the age of 19 of the child. Now, the little pictures that I have put there are just kind of to show you what the data collection looked like. It was really written respondent surveys in little booklets, right? And the moms were completing just many of these booklets. Now, in the 90s in the Czech Republic was a very interesting period from the historical point of view, because that was when the transition from the socialist economy and socialist system was happening. Just to remind you, you probably all know that 1989 was the time when the Berlin Wall came down. So these kids were born right after the Berlin Wall came down, and they were growing up during this transitory period in the Czech Republic. So interesting from our point of view, the healthcare system in 1991 was still a socialist one, pretty much. It just kind of carried on, meaning that it was centralized. All pregnant moms were seeing care in kind of a centralized way, and doctors had authority, meaning that if the doctors gave the survey to a mom, she filled it in, right? So it's just not like that anymore. But at that time, we got a pretty high compliance rate. And the reason why I put those many booklets there, because it really was just slews and slews of data that were collected from these moms, and these moms were compliant at that time. There are about 52,000 variables in this database, which is just incomprehensible to me, that somebody would go through all this process for 19 years filling in surveys. And the interesting part is without much of acknowledgement or even seeing results or anything like that, because these data, these questionnaires, paper questionnaires, were in boxes that you can see there. They were at the basement of Masaryk University, of the medical faculty, and they were just, you know, getting moldy there. And nobody really had capacity to do anything with it. And it was just boxes and boxes and boxes, full basement of boxes of questionnaires. And finally, in about 2013, Resetox recognized the value of these data and collected enough money or had enough funding to digitize it. So this database has not been available just because it wasn't digitized, and only for about a year the data is actually available in a clean form, relatively clean form. I have worked with the data, so I know that there are issues, but it's a relatively clean data, and it's not on paper anymore, so that's a good thing, right? So here is the structure of the data set. As you can see, there are several informants. The child is the focus. There is a focal child, and the information about this child is collected from moms, it's collected from fathers, and it's also collected from the child himself or herself when the child reaches about 11 years of age. But before that, it is mothers and fathers reporting on the child. Then we also have pediatricians. Again, centralized healthcare. We kind of have a track record of the medical charts in the pediatrics office since birth, and it's accessible. So pediatricians are reporting, and medical chart review is done at multiple time points, and teachers are actually a part of this survey, and they are reporting on the child. So it's a very multi-perspective way of looking at a single phenomenon. Here are just the numbers of participating families. I just wanted to show you, as you probably would guess, there was attrition. The attrition probably wasn't as bad as it would be now with the non-participation that was mentioned earlier by Jeremy Fries, but there is attrition. All the participating families have medical data available, but only some of them have also filled in survey, and then the bottom line there, those are teachers. So teachers constitute kind of the smallest portion of non-missing data. So we have compared the ELSPAC cohort to the Czech population at large on several indicators. I have listed them there just to see to what degree ELSPAC cohort mirrors the Czech population. And on some variables, it does so well. For gender, for instance, gender of the child, you can see that there is very little difference in terms of maternal age and birth weight. There are some small differences, but it's nothing really to write home about. It's basically showing what the population should look like. Okay, data collection methods, that's another interesting piece. Pen and paper survey, mothers, fathers or partners. Then we had pediatricians, and children started reporting on themselves at the age of 11. Teachers started reporting at the age of 7. For the chart review, all the current and past diagnosis, medical history, also all the diagnostic tests and treatments, records of hospitalizations are available, also physical therapy and some basic anthropometry figures. And then the kids also went through clinical examination. So that was separate from the medical chart review. They just went to see the doctor for that particular purpose. They went usually with their moms. Interestingly enough, even the mom provided some data, such as anthropometry. But the kids themselves provided anthropometry. There was also some blood pressure readings. There was a stress test with blood pressure after the stress. There was vision, hearing, screening, abdomen by palpitation, lungs by stethoscope, examination of posture, joint mobility, just kind of a physical. So it was a physical, really, right? So there were no blood samples drawn or urine wasn't analyzed, but the physician kind of overall checked out the child. So that gives you an idea of kind of the richness of the data that you can get with ELSPAC. And one thing that I'm interested in is prosocial behavior. I'm interested in prosocial behavior of the child. So there was a questionnaire administered. It's a questionnaire called Strengths and Difficulties, and it has a little module on prosocial behavior in it. So I listed the questions. That was filled in by the mother about the child, by the teacher about the child, and also by the child about himself or herself. So I have 3 points of 3 perspectives on a single phenomenon of prosocial behavior, so that's really nice. Okay, so what areas are in the data? So obviously health and illness was the main focus of this study, and there is just about every type of measure that you can collect based on survey or chart review. Right? So there is subjective assessment, there is reports of various chronic and acute conditions, there are accidents and injuries, hospitalizations, growth, and so on. And interestingly, this is not only for the child, it's also for the mother and the father. So the mother and the father are reporting on themselves, and they are also reporting some data on their families. So chronic conditions of the father of the father, that's grandfather, right? Or mother of the father, and so on. So there is some notion of the health history that goes 2 generations back. I just wanted to show you again just kind of the richness of the data. Here are different questions that were asked. Now, this is for the mom and dad. So mom and dad reporting about themselves, maternal and paternal health, and there are these different time points. You can actually see it. It's not too small, right? So you can see that not every question was asked at every observation point, but mostly the table is populated. So these areas were covered for mother and for father at different time points. And then similar, if you just look at the list of areas, similar areas were also covered for the child. So here the mother is reporting on the child, and this is triangulated with chart review. So these questions, they are not really questions, but areas are covered by medical chart review and by maternal report, right? So again, you have 2 points of view. And sometimes it can actually be quite important because, for instance, I am interested in the role of stress on health outcome, and I started looking at infectious diseases in these kids. Kids are usually not very ill, but I have 2, and I know that they get these common infections, right? So I wanted to look at that, and some of these common infections are not such that mom would necessarily take them to a pediatrician, right? Like if you have a common cold, if you have herpes simplex outbreak, you know, stuff like that, it tells me something about the overall health of the child, especially if he or she is getting sick often with these minor infections. But you know, I, as a mom, I'm not going to take my kids to the pediatrician for that. So that's important. On the other hand, the pediatrician has much more accurate data, and the mom might not exactly know what that infection was. She might tell me that the child had a flu, and in fact, it was common cold by the pediatrician, right? And there are just some more, just to kind of give you a flavor of the richness of the data. Then there are some areas that were only extracted from the medical charts, but they were not asked from the mom, and you can see them right here. And some more here with pretty special. I think actually there was oral health examination. The kids had to show if they have any cavities. The pediatrician assessed the sexual development, so that has a lot to do with the onset of puberty and so on. I have all these data: onset of puberty, development, sexual development, also sexual behavior of the children, self-reported, obviously. Very rich data in terms of psychological functioning. Just several batteries of various aspects of psychomotoric and cognitive development and psychological functioning, both for the child and for the mom and dad. Family background, you know, just a lot of factors here. For social factors, that's where I am interested in. Socioeconomic status is measured relatively well. We do have household income, which is often missing in health surveys, parental and grandparental occupation. We have education here. We also have kind of like equipment of the household, which is important for this particular society, right? Like, did you have a vacuum cleaner or a car? There are excellent measures of life events. There is a list of 41 types of life events that are given to moms and to children later on, and they are basically saying this happened or didn't happen. Things like moving, or a family member died, you got a new sibling, I don't know, a pet died, which is actually stressful for children, right? Like it is very, interestingly enough, they rated the perceived stressfulness of events, and the death of pet was one of the most stressful things for kids. Imagine. Well, yeah. Okay. So, and then there are environmental exposures that were measured survey-wise as well. Now, I wanted to show you this. So you can request this data. They are not housed at Stanford yet, even though in the future it might happen. But at this point, if you go on ELSPAC website, you can fill in an application and you can request these data. Now, the data set is huge. Like I said, 52,000 variables. And so you need to say what you want, right? You need to tell them what kind of variables you want, and you are going to get de-identified data. Very briefly, because I have 10 seconds, and then I'm going to be kicked off. They are reviving the cohort right now, and part of the effort is going to be collecting biomarkers on the kids that are now in their early 20s. And they are also starting a new cohort for which there will be a much more detailed collection of biomarkers with analyses that are going to be extremely, extremely detailed. And the metabolome is going to be studied in very kind of precise ways. From my perspective as a sociologist, I'm interested in stress. So for instance, glucocorticoid metabolism is very interesting, as is tryptophan metabolism. I think I'm done because the sign is merciless. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
Can you go back to the environmental exposure slide? You went by it pretty fast.
Okay. Tell me which one.
The one that said environmental exposures.
Okay.
It's like near the end. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want me to sit down?
So maybe as a jumping off point, the two discussants can tell us a little bit about their work and how it intersects with the ELSPAC study.
Sure. So my name is Jelena Obradović. I'm a faculty at Graduate School of Education. I'm a developmental psychologist by training and by research. There's a lot of intersection, and I see a couple of points of kind of where this data could inform some of the work that I've been doing. So my work focuses on really understanding social determinants of health and child development. I look at the interplay of both biological factors and measures of biological sensitivity to context, and how that predisposes some children to be more sensitive to both positive and negative influences in environment. I think studies like this are really critical for a couple of reasons. One is there's longitudinal design with these multiple reporters and multiple waves, which I think are really critical to kind of identifying the processes, the more proximal processes by which, let's say, socioeconomic disadvantage or some larger societal factors affect the development of children, when, to what extent, what is the timing of things. I think it's exciting to see some of the stress physiology data in a bigger sample, but also in a new sample, because I think there's a lot of questions around allostatic load, or decoupling of basically children's psychological and behavioral adaptation, and then the underlying physiological costs. And we see that both in that, there is processes and experiences at school and family that undermine the biology, but also we also find that in the literature on resilience, in that our children who are thriving in the context of adversity often pay a cost with higher allostatic load over a long time. So I think these kind of studies help shed light to that. I also think the population, cohort-based, birth cohort-based approach allows us to look in more representative samples, some non-linear effects, because I think when you have a larger representative sample, you can start looking at more experiences in terms of these life events, exposure to these stressful life events, and when the negative experiences peak, and when sometimes small amounts of challenges early in life can potentially prepare children to cope better over later in life. So those are some ideas.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul English. I'm an environmental epidemiologist with the California Department of Public Health. And I'm really excited about the potential at looking at some of the environmental influences, either exposures during pregnancy that can result in adverse health outcomes in the children, or actual exposures to children. This data set actually reminds me of a similar data set that I did my dissertation on, actually, called the Child Health and Developmental Studies, that maybe some of you know about it out of UC Berkeley. In fact, this was started in the 1950s with Kaiser, and it might be actually pretty interesting to look at the hundreds of publications that came out of that work for some ideas. But as far as my work, I've done some studies with looking at agricultural pesticide exposures to women during pregnancy and risk of autism spectrum disorder in the offspring. And currently, right now, I have a large exposure study looking at particulate matter pollution in the Imperial Valley of California. But I was thinking, some of the health outcomes, especially starting with particulate matter, that one could look at, of course, respiratory illness, asthma onset, emergency room visits, hospitalizations. There's evidence that exposure to particulate matter in children can actually result in inflammation of the brain and brain abnormalities. Now these things can result in cognitive effects, so it may be interesting to look at school performance in children that are heavily exposed to PM. I don't know this area very well. Is it Brno? Is that how you say the name of the city? So it looks like that's kind of a transit hub, and there's probably a lot of traffic and industry there. Is that right?
It's the second largest city in the Czech Republic, so there is a good amount of traffic, and especially during the communist time, it was still a very industrial city, meaning it had a lot of industrial waste. So yes.
Uh-huh. And I was able to find that there's actually air quality data available in Brno from the Czech Hydrometeorological Institute.
Yes.
So I saw they have data starting in 1996 available. So I don't know, the kids would be what, like 7 or 8 or something like
Yes.
that. So that's something that could be linked to this data set. Also, using geographic information systems, you could be mapping and determining the distance of the residents to roads. Perhaps there's traffic data. Traffic has been found to be associated with a number of adverse health outcomes. I think maybe I'll stop right there. But there's, it's such a rich data set that, for example, there could be a synergistic effect of stress and exposure to air pollution on asthma or other health outcomes. That could be another hypothesis to look at. So anyway, thanks for having me.
So I have a few bigger picture questions that I'll pass on to the panel, and maybe in discussing those we can also think about some of the ELSPAC issues in particular. The first, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I don't know a ton about the Czech Republic, and I guess I would be interested in hearing people's thoughts about doing research in a context that you only have, let's just say, limited familiarity with.
Is that for us or for
the whole group?
Oh, for the whole group.
So I'm going to cheat here because I grew up in Eastern Europe. So to me, to some extent, you know, I feel like I can straddle that world, or, you know, so I think that's the exciting part that we started briefly talking about, you know, what Czech, and I grew up in Yugoslavia, Serbia. I mean, I also grew up in a country that fell apart, and now there's many of them, similar to Czechoslovakia. But so in some extent, I'm going to cheat and say I am familiar with the environment.
Well, I would just say it'd be very helpful or important to have a collaborator who could work with someone who's just an outside researcher who would understand about the data, about other sources of data. I mean, it's especially if you're going to link other sources of data to this, if you have somebody over there or somebody has contacts, just makes it so much easier than just trying to look on the internet and do it all yourself. So.
Yeah, if I may, I would think it's quite important to have somebody there that you can partner with. And the Resotox itself, that institute, would probably be able to provide connections for you if you are looking for expertise in a specific area. I think this data set has kind of two-pronged strengths. On one hand, you can use it as a longitudinal study of a transitional society, which is kind of interesting in itself. But on the other hand, I would like to argue that in many ways, this is a data set that can be used to just understand health and development of children in general. Because when you are looking at things, outcomes such as growth and development, or cognitive development, or so on, that's not going to be necessarily so affected by social factors, depending on what is your independent variable of interest. But controlling for some of the social factors will be important, obviously. But I think that this data set in itself lends itself to a lot of general questions that might have relevance for any nation, and it could be used similarly to the Danish birth cohort studies or ELSPAC birth cohort and so on.
Given that a lot of the time this morning was spent talking about administrative data, I was wondering if we could talk some about the benefits of using longitudinal perspective cohorts and what they bring to the table that administrative data is unlikely to offer.
Well, one thing I would say is, I wasn't here for the discussion on administrative data, but it's probably very difficult to do linkage with administrative data if you're looking at generational effects, or you wanted to pair parents off with offspring. I don't know which administrative data sets you were discussing, but in a longitudinal cohort like this, you're able to have that linkage, look at generational effects of your factors of interest, and then just the ability with a cohort study design, you can look at things. Actually looking at causation, which you can't necessarily look at if you're doing some type of cross-sectional study or something with administrative data.
Yeah, I think the richness of the data and coming closer to the child and the processes that happen in home, getting multiple perspectives, which Irena was highlighting, ability to triangulate the parent and the teacher and the father report and self-report is kind of critical to understanding the family system perspective, right? Which gets us to these micro-social experiences and closer to understanding how we get this biological embedding of things like socioeconomic status. So like looking at these larger, broader indicators of, let's say, income inequality or socioeconomic status, it's one thing, but if we can start understanding what happens in the family, what happens to this child at different developmental stages, at sensitive periods potentially, intersect with some individual level differences, I think we're that much closer in understanding the mechanisms potentially through which toxins affect asthma prevalence, or even cognitive development, and getting assessments directly of the child, I think, is additionally a bonus of this kind of data set.
And as far as the linkage goes, there are efforts right now to link this data set to not only the air pollution samples that are available, but also to vital statistics, national kind of registries of diseases in the Czech Republic, and also to insurance records. So these efforts are being in progress right now, and because of the structure of the institute and its prioritizing of this effort, I think they are going to be doable.
Okay, so this question is it's going to be maybe a little rambling, but ultimately I'm hoping we can give PHS maybe a useful nudge here. So if I remember the rules of monopoly correctly, once you had all the properties that had a certain color, there were real returns to that. You could like put a house on them and things of that nature. And so in some ways, there's this world of data that's kind of like the monopoly board, and there are a few clustered sets of properties. So I was not familiar with this ELSPAC family. I knew about ELSPAC, but I didn't know it was part of a broader family. There's the HRS and European versions of that. And I guess I'm wondering what you all think of as the potential for large returns to assembling that entire family of data sets here at PHS.
Well, I think the potential is tremendous. I mean, I cannot tell you enough about how much it would enable my work as a sociologist if I had data that really span the life course and that bring different perspectives on why health outcomes happen and how health is shaped across the life course by social and psychological factors. So like from my perspective, that's really what has been holding back a lot of work in this area, that we just did not have data sets that would span these different areas. So I think the benefits could be very, very high.
I mean, I'll second what Irena has said. We have a lot of new efforts to align measurement across multiple different sites, and this seems kind of like has already exist, right? And I don't know, one of the questions that I jotted down is like how much, mentioned the questionnaires in ELSPAC is exactly the same, but how much overlap there is between all of these different cohorts or different sub-studies. But I think from developmental child perspective, which includes both, mental health, cognitive development, physical health, we often ask ourselves, what processes and findings translates, let's say in the middle income countries that we have observed in the high income countries. And I think, trying to understand that in this kind of a multi-cohort perspective would just provide more rigorous replication evidence. In what ways certain things are universal, and in which ways they're maybe country or site specific. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good idea to host it here as long as I can have access to it.
Noted.
The practicality is the only thing holding the effort back, yeah. But I don't think it's gonna be like with census, I am not talking 2 or 3 years to get access.
So at this point, I see that they both have lots of notes. I'm happy to turn the floor over to you all if there are any questions or points you'd like to make about the study, and then after that, we can maybe have a broader discussion with the audience.
I have one question about attrition. Not knowing how this data was collected. Obviously the attrition is high, the percentage is high, but how systematic? Can you tell us a little bit about? I'm sure it's been probed in terms of how in what ways the sample that remained is biased or not.
So interestingly enough, it hasn't. It hasn't. Just like I said, this is a new database, and there can be a lot of work done on it still. But I have done some probing on my own regarding the variables that I am interested in. And so the moms that stay in the cohort have higher socioeconomic status. They are more educated. They are also a little bit older. The younger moms are more likely to drop out. and they are the ones who were having the first child. So if the child was a firstborn, the moms are more likely to stay in the cohort, which I also understand now, being a mom of two. So you know, when you have 2 or 3, you just don't have as much time, right? So, so those are the things that I have seen. As far as the other indicators of sociodemographics, I didn't really see that much of a difference, but I think a systematic investigation of the attrition needs to be done.
I was wondering about the school environment. You know, of course, children spend a lot of time at school besides their home address. So I was wondering, it's probably the address for each child where they go to school is available, because I was thinking that could be there could be an environmental assessment done around the school location. For example, there could be air pollution modeling around the school, or looking at traffic. I know there's literature that has shown that children that attend schools in highly trafficked areas do more poorly than those with less trafficked areas. So that would be something interesting.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and that data is certainly that's doable, because we know where they went to school, both in the grade school and then in the so-called secondary school. So there are no high schools as such, but there are different types of secondary school, and the secondary school is an how to put it, like a stratification step up. So children profile at the age of 14 to what kind of secondary school they are gonna go, and based on that, their career trajectory is pretty much determined in terms of, are they gonna go to college or not? Are they gonna, you know, stay with a trade or profession? Are they gonna be middle management or secretarial? So interestingly, just the thing that just occurred to me as you mentioned your question was that I never thought of whether the location of the school is stratified based on pollution, right? So is it so that the prep schools, the elite schools, are in cleaner parts of the town than the industrial training schools? And I don't know, I would have to look just kind of from the knowledge of N of 1, right? I think it is so to some degree, but it would be interesting in itself.
I have one question for you to the audience. Is there any effort to systematically replicate findings from ELSPAC that can be followed up in ELSPAC?
No, there is no systematic effort. Like, so right now the database has been cleaned, and that's a major accomplishment, and it's up for grabs, so to speak. So a systematic effort, no. However, what I want to do, I actually want to request ELSPAC data, which is publicly available, and I want to do my own analysis comparing the 2 cohorts and trying to see to what degree ELSPAC maps on ELSPAC in some of the major relationships that I'm interested in.
I have a question, if we have time. It's actually 2 questions. One is, in one of the publications you shared with us, it's mentioned that potentially you'll continue to follow or maybe go back. And so if you can talk a little bit about the efforts of what would be collected, or is there a timeline, and, you know, will that happen? And then also, I know you were rushed towards the end about the new cohort. So if you can maybe tell us a little bit about, again, the timing of the new cohort and what is underway. And
yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't have enough time for that, because I think that's really, really exciting. And that's what got me interested in this whole project. Because when I heard what they are trying to do, I was like, oh my gosh. So, so the plan is to collect a sample of about 7,000 births, a birth cohort of about 7,000 consecutive births in a major university hospital in Brno. And the moms are gonna be approached in pregnancy again, and they are gonna fill in a battery of surveys that are not gonna be quite as extensive as the ones that have been done in ELSPAC, just because we know that they wouldn't respond. And the surveys are gonna be done online to a large degree as well. So the moms can fill in the questionnaires, you know, at home, online. They are gonna provide various biospecimens, from blood, urine, saliva, hair samples, buccal samples. There might be a few others that microbiota. So there will be a number of different samples that will be aliquoted and analyzed for the things that we already want to know, such as metabolome, but they are also going to be frozen for future analysis, meaning that, you know, in 20 years when we finally figure out how stress works in the body and what are the markers of stress and what distinguishes stress kids that are resilient from those who kind of have emotional and behavioral problems, we will have that. We will have those data. We will have them. We will have the samples, and they can be reanalyzed. So there is going to be genetic sequencing done, and there is going to be analysis for microbiome, for markers of contaminants in the biosamples, and several others. So the moms are going to be caught, so to speak, in mid-pregnancy, and then during the birth, there is going to be another data collection, and they will be followed in a way similar to ELSPAC. It's planned for 20 years, right? But I guess funding is not as predictable as we wish. But that is in the works. Now, what I really like about that, as a sociologist who is interested in health, is that I could design the social survey to some degree. So I had some input into what social factors are going to be measured, even though it got cut down quite a bit in terms of the interest in size. Psychological factors are going to be measured as well. Self-rated health is going to be included, such as SF36, right? There are going to be measures of diet, food frequency questionnaire, so this cohort should have about 7,000 people. Right now, the pilot has been done. So the pilot has collected about 300 observations and has only piloted the biosamples part of this study. So basically collecting the samples, you know, the standard procedures for collecting the samples, analyzing the samples, storing the samples, plus some basic demographics. The social survey, what I call a long-form survey, hasn't been piloted yet, but that's the next phase, and that might have to be changed if we find that it is too long or that moms don't understand or something like that. So that's where the cohort is right now. So it is right at the start, which kind of makes it both very interesting and also uninteresting, because it will take a long time before we have these kids at school age or at adolescence. But I think that's an effort worth keeping in mind, definitely.
So I think we have about 5 minutes for questions from the audience.
Well, I'll start with one. Do you have my mic on? You can hear me good. So one of the things that you mentioned, and I mentioned actually earlier, Irena, in describing the ELSPAC cohort, is the remarkable timing that occurred, you know, in the wake of the Berlin Wall coming down. And I'm assuming, from what I know, probably less than at least two of you on the stage know, about the events that occurred in Central Europe during the wake of that, you know, major historic event, were extraordinarily stressful. So that just the mortality rates among men in Czechoslovakia, as well as virtually all of the neighboring countries, was extraordinary, suggesting to me that there is probably something to be learned about stress, either in utero, if you could more narrowly time it based on something that the families have given you, or during early childhood, which might all by itself, by comparison to the Bristol cohort or others, be quite interesting. And I wonder whether any of the work that you've done to date has sort of tried to look at the exposure side, where here I'm talking primarily about exposure in terms of major social upheaval, like fathers losing jobs, for example, or other life events of that kind, which were presumably extremely frequent during that first couple of years.
So this is certainly a very interesting question. So I would say that the fall of the wall and the transition towards socialism, whether or not it was perceived as stressful, depending kind of on your social position. So people from the lower classes, that was extremely stressful because they were losing a lot of kind of protections from the government. For people who were from the kind of more educated parts of the society, they often welcomed the change. Now, I would say that there is theory in psychology about eustress, right? So even those who were happy, this was just such a major upheaval time in the society that I don't think there was anybody whose adrenaline wasn't up to the roof at that time, right? So that's the turn of the tables in itself. Now, what happened afterwards is what interests me, because that's when people started losing jobs, because all of a sudden there was no job protection. Companies started collapsing like houses of cards, you know. So people were losing jobs. They were not used to the idea of having to requalify. Like that was something unheard of at that time because you know, you got a job, you were placed by the government to a certain factory or company, and you stayed in that factory or company till you retired. Like that was kind of what my mom and dad did, right? So the idea of having to requalify and having to find a way in a completely new environment of this market economy, that was very stressful. Now, what I want to look at is the job loss that you suggested. So basically what happened to kids from families whose fathers were losing jobs. Now how that differed by social class, and which of these families were the resilient ones. So which weathered the change better than others based on maybe social support or some other mechanisms that could offset the blow. So there is a lot that can be done on that. Now, I did look at the Great Recession because the data covers that. Now, the Great Recession, again, was, you know, in Czech Republic, just like here, perhaps not to that degree. Czech Republic was a little bit more sheltered, but nevertheless, there was a lot of job loss, there was a lot of economic hardship, and I wanted to see how the job loss of the father at that time influenced emotional symptoms in adolescence. And interestingly enough, the highest impact was not quite at the time of the recession, so that's 2008 to 2009, I think, but afterwards. So it was the kind of the after effects, the ripple effects of the Great Recession, when I think the capacity for resilience was exhausted in many families.
So you'd be glad to know we observed exactly the same thing in the children of the Alcoa families, which it started a couple of years later than the actual recession, interestingly enough. Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thank you.